Story number 1.
It was a late autumn evening when I moved into my new apartment. The building, a small, weathered structure, was tucked away on a quiet street, far from the bustle of downtown. The kind of place where everything felt frozen in time. The kind of place I had hoped would offer me peace and solitude after a difficult few years. I'd always preferred being alone, especially at night, so the idea of having an entire apartment to myself felt like a fresh start. The first few nights were peaceful. I'd come home from work, made dinner, and settled into this small, cozy space. There was something comforting about the soft creaks of the floorboards and the low hum of the old pipes. It was all part of the charm of the place. At least that's what I told myself. But as the days passed, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. The apartment wasn't quite as peaceful as it seemed. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it wasn't long before I couldn't ignore the oddities any longer. I'd hear the sounds of footsteps when no one was there, soft and deliberate, like someone was walking through the apartment just outside of my line of sight. The first time it happened, I dismissed it. Buildings settle. There were always strange noises when living in an older place, but the noises didn't stop. They continued night after night, growing more frequent, more distinct. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, reading, when I heard it again. This time, it was a loud bang, followed by a dragging sound as if something heavy was being moved across the floor. My heart skipped a beat as I put down my book, straining to listen. It came from the room next door, the bedroom. I stood up slowly, trying to make out the sound, but there was only silence. I walked to the bedroom and turned on the light. The room was empty. Nothing was out of place. The bed was made, and everything was where I had left it. But the air in the room felt off. It was thick, almost heavy, as though something was there. But I couldn't see it. I stood in the doorway for a moment, my heart pounding, and when I couldn't find anything unusual, I decided to go back to the living room, convincing myself it was just the house settling. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard it again. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A tapping sound. Slow. Steady. It came from the far corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, my eyes wide open in the darkness. The tapping continued, rhythmic, as though someone was knocking on the wall. I wanted to get up and investigate, but I couldn't move. I lay there, frozen, my body paralyzed with fear. The sound continued for what felt like an eternity, until it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, thick with tension, as though whatever had been there had finally noticed me. I didn't sleep that night. Not at all. The next day, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe the old pipes were just playing tricks on me. But the following night, it happened again, the tapping. But this time, it was louder, closer. It was as though someone was standing right next to my bed, gently tapping on the wall. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment. There was no one there. The room was exactly as I had left it, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive. I walked through the apartment, checking every room, opening every closet, but everything was as it should be. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided I needed to get out for a while. I went to a friend's house for the night, hoping that the fresh air and change of scenery would clear my head. But even at my friend's place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping sound seemed to echo in my mind, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed. The next night, I returned to the apartment, determined to face whatever was happening. I turned on all the lights, trying to banish the darkness, but the sense of unease still hung in the air. I sat on the couch, listening intently. For a while, there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. But then, I heard it again. The tapping. It was coming from the bedroom. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked toward the door. My heart was racing, and my legs felt like lead as I approached the threshold. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. I opened the door, shining the light around the room. Again, nothing was out of place. But the atmosphere was heavy, like something unseen was there, watching me. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back to the living room and sat down, exhausted. I told myself I was just overreacting, that there was a logical explanation for all of this. I needed rest. I needed to calm down. But the tapping continued, faint at first, then growing louder, until it was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside the room. I turned and looked toward the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. The shadows seemed to shift as if something was moving within them. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the light. I froze, unable to move. The figure was tall and thin, with a shadowy outline that seemed to blur with the darkness around it. Its face was pale, its features barely discernible in the dim light. The eyes, those eyes were wide open, dark and empty, as though they were staring directly at me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure slowly raised its hand and pointed at me. That's when I heard the voice. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the wind, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was right in my ear. "You're not alone." I couldn't take it any longer. I ran out of the apartment, not bothering to grab anything, just out into the night. I didn't stop until I reached my friend's house, where I stayed for several days, too afraid to return. When I finally mustered the courage to go back, the apartment was empty. The landlord told me no one had lived there for months. But when I walked through the door, the same feeling of dread washed over me. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was even worse. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been. I moved out the next week. I never spoke about it to anyone again, and I didn't stay in any place for too long after that. I wasn't sure what I had experienced or what had been in that apartment with me. All I knew was that I was never truly alone that night, and in some strange way, I don't think I ever will be. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
I had always been the type of person who preferred being alone at night. There was a sense of peace in the solitude, a kind of quiet that I found comforting. I moved into an older apartment in the city, not long after my divorce. The place was small, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards, but it was affordable and had a certain charm to it. I didn't mind the age of the building. In fact, I found it cozy. It felt like it had a story to tell, and I was content to live quietly among its walls. The first few nights went by without incident. I would come home from work, settle into my new routine, and enjoy the silence of the evening. I spent most of my time reading or watching TV. And when I finally turned in for the night, I would drift off easily, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creaks of the building lulling me to sleep. But one night, around the third week of living there, things began to change. I was sitting in my living room reading a book when I heard a soft sound coming from down the hall. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder. A light tapping noise, like fingers gently rapping against the wall. I put my book down and listened, my heart skipping a beat. The sound wasn't constant, but rhythmic, and it seemed to come from the direction of my bedroom. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the pipes, maybe just the house settling. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted. It wasn't getting any louder, but it was still there, tapping away, almost like someone was knocking gently at the wall. I stood up and walked to the hallway, but when I opened the bedroom door, there was nothing there. The room was empty. I checked the closet, the bathroom, and even under the bed. Everything was in its place. Still, something didn't feel right. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I left the room quickly and shut the door behind me. I returned to the living room, but my mind was racing. The tapping had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing just out of sight, watching me from the shadows. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, the sound of footsteps moving across the floor, the faintest rustle of something brushing against the walls. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow pass by my bedroom door, but when I got up to check, there was nothing there. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear wouldn't go away. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. The next night, I returned to the apartment, determined to ignore the strange occurrences. I convinced myself it was just my anxiety, that the noise was from the building settling. But the tapping started again, softer this time, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I turned off the lights and lay in bed, hoping the darkness would make it stop. But it didn't. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my friend, asking if I could stay over for the night. I told them I was just feeling anxious, but I knew deep down that something was wrong. I wasn't going to stay in that apartment another night. The next day, I returned to the apartment, feeling a little foolish for having left so suddenly. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but when I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The air felt colder than it should have, and the silence was almost oppressive. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of unease lingered, thick and heavy, hanging in the air like a cloud. As the evening wore on, I heard the tapping again. This time, it wasn't just coming from the bedroom, it was coming from all over the apartment. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, as though the very structure of the building was alive. I tried to ignore it, but the noise only grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like it was surrounding me. I stood in the middle of the living room, heart racing, the tapping growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't just a random noise anymore. It was deliberate, intentional, and it was coming from inside the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine as the room seemed grow colder, the air growing thicker and heavier by the second. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, to get out of the apartment, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the walls, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The door to my bedroom slowly creaked open, despite the fact that I hadn't touched it. It opened just a crack, but enough to see the shadows shifting inside the room. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came from my throat. I was paralyzed with fear. The room was silent for a moment, and then I heard it. Soft whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. They were coming from the bedroom, coming from the very walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the malice in the voice. It was as if someone, or something, was speaking directly into my mind. I ran out of the apartment, not caring about my things or anything else. I just needed to get out. I went to my friend's house again, unable to shake the image of the dark room and the whispers that still echoed in my mind. The next day, I decided to call the landlord. I was hesitant, not wanting to sound crazy, but I needed to know if there was any explanation for the things that had been happening. When I explained the noises and the strange occurrences, the landlord was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, his voice low. "You're not the first person to mention strange things happening in that apartment. In fact, a few tenants have left for the same reasons. They say it's haunted." I was stunned. Haunted? I had never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. But after everything that had happened, I wasn't so sure anymore. The landlord didn't offer any more details, but he apologized and said he would have someone come by to check it out. I never returned to that apartment. I moved into a new place a week later, far from the apartment that had left me so shaken. But the strange feeling never quite left me. I still hear the tapping sometimes, late at night, as if it's following me, always just on the edge of hearing. And sometimes when the silence is too thick, I catch myself listening for whispers in the walls. I don't know what I experienced in that apartment, but I do know one thing for certain. I was never truly alone there. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
I had always been a practical person, a skeptic when it came to anything supernatural. Ghost stories were just that, stories. My own life had enough reality to deal with, and I never found myself indulging in things I couldn't explain. That is, until one night when I was alone in my apartment. It started as a typical evening. I had recently moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of the city. I was still getting used to the new space, but I had settled in well enough. The apartment was old but charming, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and tall windows that let in the soft glow of streetlights at night. I didn't mind the creaks. I found them comforting, part of the building's character. It was a Tuesday, and I had been working late. By the time I arrived home, it was already past midnight. The apartment was dark and still, the only sound coming from the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my bag on the couch, and made my way to the kitchen to grab a snack. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt a sudden chill in the air. I paused, a shiver running down my spine. The thermostat had been set at a comfortable temperature and the heating system was working fine. But the kitchen felt cold, unnaturally so. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the draft from the old windows. I grabbed some leftovers from the fridge, but as I closed the door, I heard something. It was faint at first, like the rustling of paper. I turned, expecting to see a stack of papers or something else that might have fallen, but nothing was out of place. The kitchen counter was clean, and the room seemed as empty as it had been moments ago. I hesitated, wondering if it was just the house settling, as old houses often do. I turned back to the counter and started to eat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had crept into my chest. But then, it happened again. This time, it was louder. A soft tapping noise, as if someone was lightly knocking on the wall. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, where there was nothing but an empty chair and a small table. I froze. My heart rate quickened and my stomach twisted into a knot. The sound was coming from the far side of the kitchen, where the wall met the ceiling. I walked slowly toward the wall, my breath shallow and quick. There was nothing there, no sign of anything that could have made the sound. I told myself it was the house settling again, that it was just the wind outside making the building creak. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made my way back to the living room, trying to push the unsettling sensation to the back of my mind. I sat on the couch, turning on the TV to distract myself. But the noise didn't stop. The tapping continued, louder now, almost rhythmic. It wasn't just coming from the kitchen anymore. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the apartment, as if something was walking slowly through the rooms. My hands trembled as I gripped the remote. I didn't want to be scared, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to focus on the TV, but every time the tapping grew louder, I felt a cold draft rush through the room. I stood up, my heart pounding, and grabbed my phone. I texted my friend, asking if they were still awake, but I didn't want to call. I didn't want to sound ridiculous. I paced the apartment, the tapping growing in intensity, now accompanied by a faint rustling sound. The noise was impossible to ignore, and my mind raced with thoughts of what could be causing it. Was it the pipes? The building settling? But no, this was something else. I felt it in my gut. I had to know what it was. I decided to check the rest of the apartment. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, my steps heavy and deliberate, as if trying to keep my own nerves in check. I flipped on the light and glanced around. The room was exactly as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the bathroom next. Empty. I turned on the light there, half expecting to see something out of the ordinary, but there was nothing. The noise didn't stop, though. It was growing louder with every step I took, like something was moving closer. I felt a surge of panic. I knew it wasn't my imagination anymore. Whatever it was real. My heart raced as I turned back toward the living room. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. The door to the closet, which I had left ajar earlier, was now fully open. I hadn't gone near it. I never opened it after I moved in, and I hadn't planned to. The closet was small and dark, filled with boxes I hadn't yet unpacked. I stared at the door, my breath catching in my throat. I approached cautiously, the air in the room colder than before. The tapping had stopped, but now there was something else. Soft, dragging footsteps, like something or someone was moving slowly across the floor. My mind screamed for me to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pushed the closet door open. The closet was empty, except for a few boxes and an old blanket that had been pushed aside. I let out a shaky breath, relieved for a moment, until I saw something strange. A small, pale handprint on the inside of the door. It wasn't dust or dirt. It was fresh. My blood ran cold as I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might explode. The footsteps came again, closer this time, as if they were right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I couldn't breathe. My mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. The apartment was empty. It was just me. Or was it? I ran to the front door, my heart racing as I fumbled with the lock. I didn't care about anything anymore. I needed to get out. The door flew open and I stepped out into the hallway, gasping for air. I could still feel the presence behind me, something invisible yet tangible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to turn around. I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I called my friend, this time not caring how ridiculous I sounded. They picked up on the third ring. Hello? I can't stay here, I gasped, my voice trembling. Something's wrong. Something's in the apartment. I don't know what it is, but I need help. My friend listened as I explained everything, but they didn't sound convinced. You're probably just tired, stressed out. You've been through a lot recently. Why don't you come stay with me for a few days? I didn't argue. I needed to get out, to get away from that place, but I didn't want to be alone anymore. Not in that apartment. Not in that building. I stayed with my friend for several days, and when I returned, the apartment felt different. The air was still, the coldness gone. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I moved out soon after, finding another place in the city, but every time I think about that night, I feel the same sense of unease. I never found out what caused the tapping or the strange sensations. I don't think I want to know. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was a cold, lonely winter night. I had just moved into an old apartment on the edge of town, one of those buildings with creaky floors and long hallways that felt like they had a life of their own. I was eager to start fresh in this quiet, somewhat secluded place. The rent was cheap, and the apartment was small but charming, with vintage wallpaper and an antique radiator that hummed every time the heat came on. I wasn't used to living alone. I had shared apartments in college, and even though I had lived in my own space before, I'd always been surrounded by noise, by people, by something other than silence. That night, I finally found myself alone in my new apartment. My roommates had moved out earlier that week, and the place was eerily still. I sat in the living room, my feet propped up on the couch as I tried to relax and get used to the quiet. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows in their frames. It sounded like a storm was coming, and the thought made me feel even more isolated. The kind of isolation where the silence isn't peaceful but unnerving. I was sitting there, half watching TV and half lost in my thoughts when I heard something, a faint thud from somewhere in the apartment. I froze. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a soft knock, a thump coming from one of the rooms down the hallway. My heart raced, but I shook my head. It was probably nothing. The old building was settling, the pipes expanding in the cold, maybe the radiator shifting. But then it happened again. Thud, thud, thud. I sat up straight, my pulse quickening. I couldn't ignore it now. It wasn't the building. It was a noise, distinct and purposeful, like someone was knocking on my bedroom door, but that there was no one there. I got up cautiously and walked toward the hallway, the sound of my own footsteps almost drowned out by the noise outside. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the living room lamp behind me. I stood at the threshold of the hallway, looking down at the closed bedroom door at the end of it. The thuds had stopped, and now all I could hear was my own breathing, shallow and anxious. I felt stupid for getting worked up over a noise. I had just moved in, and it was an old building. There were bound to be creaks and groans, but the air felt heavy, uncomfortably so. I decided to check the bedroom. The door was still shut, and there was no sign of anything out of place. I opened it slowly, expecting nothing more than the quiet stillness I had grown accustomed to. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The room was colder than the rest of the apartment, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the heat was on. I flipped on the light, half expecting to find something, but there was nothing there. Nothing unusual at all. I stood there for a moment, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Was it just my imagination running wild? I shook my head and turned to leave, but then I heard it again. A soft whisper coming from somewhere near the window. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. It was a voice, but too soft to make out any words. I turned toward the window, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. The room was still empty, but the whisper was clearer now, almost like it was right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My breath was ragged, and I could feel the panic starting to rise in my chest. I turned on every light in the apartment, every lamp, every fixture, as if the light could keep whatever it was at bay. But the fear didn't subside. The apartment, once so cozy, now felt cold and suffocating. I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with the TV again, but every sound in the apartment made my heart race. The refrigerator hum, the faint creak of the floorboards, every sound now felt like an intrusion, a warning that something was in the house with me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just getting used to being alone, but the feeling persisted. The apartment was too quiet, too still, and then just as I was beginning to calm down, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder. Thud, thud, thud. It came from the closet in the hallway. I jumped up from the couch and rushed to the hallway, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind raced with every possible explanation. A draft, an animal in the walls, the wind shifting the furniture. But none of it made sense. None of it felt right. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the closet door. It was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint outline of shadows inside. The room was still cold, colder than the rest of the apartment, and I could feel something watching me. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I had no idea what I expected to find, but when I opened it, there was nothing inside. No one. Just coats and boxes. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and closed the door. But as I turned to leave, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. Soft. Whispers. Get out. The words weren't clear, but they were unmistakable. I felt my knees go weak, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I could breathe. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay another minute in that apartment, alone, with whatever it was. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not caring that I hadn't even put on my coat. I ran down the stairs of the building, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I was standing on the sidewalk outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. I stayed with a friend that night, and I didn't return to the apartment for days. When I finally went back to get my things, everything was exactly as I had left it. The apartment was quiet again, eerily so, and nothing out of the ordinary seemed to have happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whatever it was that had been in that apartment was still there, lurking in the shadows. I moved out a week later, and I never looked back. The building, still as old as ever, remained behind me, but the memories, the whispers, the knocking, stayed with me. I don't know what I experienced that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if there was something else entirely. But I do know this. I will never forget the feeling of being completely, utterly alone at night, with something or someone watching me from the dark. Story. The end.
Story number 5.
I'll never forget the night I realized I wasn't truly alone. It was late fall, and I had just moved into a small, quiet apartment in a neighborhood that seemed to have been frozen in time. The apartment building was old, the kind with creaky floorboards and dimly lit hallways. I had always liked the idea of living in a place like this, somewhere with character, somewhere that felt more personal than the sterile, new apartments I had lived in before. At first, it was exactly what I wanted: quiet, private, peaceful. I spent most evenings curled up with a book or watching TV, the stillness of the apartment wrapping me in a sense of calm. I was used to being alone. Being in my own space felt good, safe. But that peace started to feel off after a while. The first thing I noticed was the noises. It wasn't anything alarming at first, just the occasional creak of the floorboards or a faint tapping sound, like someone was tapping their nails against the walls. I told myself it was the house settling. Old buildings do that, right? But then it started happening more often. Sometimes, when I was lying in bed, I'd hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking down the hall outside my bedroom door. It was always late at night when the apartment was at its quietest. I'd get up to check, but every time there was no one there. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe there were animals in the walls. Still, the unease lingered. It was almost as if the house was alive, like it was trying to tell me something. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, just unwinding with a book, when I heard the tapping again. But this time it was different. It was louder, more insistent. I looked toward the hallway where I could see the faint outline of the kitchen light glowing from under the door. I don't know why, but I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to go check it out. I stood up and walked toward the hallway, my pulse quickening. The closer I got to the kitchen, the more the tapping seemed to intensify. It was coming from inside the kitchen now, from the corner near the window. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. I knew no one should have been in there. I was alone in the apartment, no visitors, no roommates, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in there, waiting. With a deep breath, I opened the door. The kitchen was empty. Nothing was out of place. The dishes were stacked neatly by the sink, and the refrigerator hummed quietly. I scanned the room, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I stood there for a moment, still feeling the weight of someone else's presence in the room with me. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, like someone breathing right behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The room was still empty. No one was there. I stood frozen, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something in the air had changed. The silence felt suffocating, as if the room was pressing in on me. I felt eyes on me, watching from the corners of the room, but there was no one there to watch. I slammed the door behind me and hurried back to the living room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the house was just old. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had felt something in that room. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed up late, turning the volume up on the TV just to drown out the silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light made my heart race. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows dancing in the corners of the room, heard faint whispers just beyond the edge of my hearing. The next few days were no better. The footsteps continued, louder now, sometimes right outside my door, sometimes in the hallway. At one point, I even swore I saw a figure standing in the kitchen, but when I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I called my friend Sarah, desperate to talk to someone. She had always been the rational one, the one who didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. She would tell me it was just the stress of the move, that I was just hearing things. She would make it better. But when she picked up the phone, her voice was different. Her tone was cautious, almost hesitant. "Sarah?" I said, trying to sound calm. "I need to talk to you about something. I've been hearing things in my apartment. I think there's something wrong with the place." I know," she interrupted, her voice soft but serious. "I think I know what you're talking about." I was confused. "What do you mean? You know about the noises?" "Not exactly," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But when I came to visit last week, I had the feeling there was something here, something watching me. It wasn't just the house settling. It felt different." My stomach twisted. "Are you saying you believe me?" "I'm saying you're not imagining things," she said, her voice almost shaking. "I don't know what's in that apartment, but I've felt it too. There's something in there with you." I didn't know what to say. I felt a rush of relief and fear, like I wasn't crazy after all, but it didn't make the fear any less real. That night, the sounds grew worse. The footsteps were louder, closer, and this time I could hear breathing, soft, labored, like someone was standing right next to me. I could feel the temperature drop in the room, the air thick and heavy with something I couldn't see but could feel all around me. The whispers returned, just out of reach, so faint I couldn't make out the words. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. My body was frozen, my mind paralyzed with fear. But somehow I found the courage to stand up. I grabbed my phone and texted Sarah. "I think I need help. Something's here with me." Then, just as I was about to put the phone down, I saw it. In the doorway, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, thin, and distorted, its features blurred like it was made of smoke. But there was something in its eyes, something cold, something dead. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare, frozen, as the figure slowly moved toward me, its footfalls soundless against the floor. It was so close now I could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that sank deep into my bones. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I was standing in the parking lot outside, gasping for air. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I fumbled to call Sarah again. I never went back to that apartment. I couldn't. Something in that place had been watching me, waiting for me. And though I never fully understood what it was, I knew I had to get out before it got to me. I stayed with Sarah for a while, and after some time, I moved into a new place, far away from the apartment that had never been mine. But to this day, I still hear the footsteps in the back of my mind. I still feel the weight of those eyes on me, waiting, watching. And no matter how far I run, I'll never truly be alone at night again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I moved into the old house on Willow Lane just after my divorce, needing to escape the chaos and find some peace. The house, though weathered, had a charm to it that I loved. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to be alone. The creaky floors, the overgrown yard, and the smell of aged wood felt comforting, as though it had stories to tell. For the first few weeks, everything was quiet. I spent my evenings alone, curled up with a book or binge-watching my favorite shows. The house was large for just one person, but I liked the space. It gave me room to breathe, to think. However, as the nights wore on, I began to notice something strange. It started small. The feeling of being watched. A chill running down my spine when I was alone in the kitchen. A fleeting shadow passing the edge of my vision in the hallway. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it began to get worse. It was a Wednesday night, about 3 weeks into my stay. The wind was howling outside, rattling the old windows, and the house creaked under the pressure. I was reading in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls, when I heard a faint sound. At first, it was just a whisper, like a breath or a faint murmur, coming from the hallway outside. I froze listening. The house was usually dead quiet at night, so any noise would catch my attention. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and glanced around. Nothing. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. The wind, the house settling, anything to explain away what I had heard. But as soon as I returned to my seat, the sound came again. This time it was louder, almost like someone was dragging their feet across the floor. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I stood up once more, my heart racing now, and slowly walked toward the hallway. I knew I had to check. I had to make sure it wasn't some trick of the house. The air in the hallway was colder than usual, almost as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. I reached the stairs and peered up into the darkness. My pulse quickened. "Hello?" I called softly. My voice echoed eerily in the silence. No answer. I took a step up the stairs, my feet heavy against the old wooden steps. I crept down the hall toward the back bedroom, the one that was furthest from the stairs. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I approached the door. It was slightly ajar, but the room was pitch dark. I had never gone in there before, but something told me I needed to now. I reached for the light switch, but hesitated before flipping it on. It felt wrong, like I shouldn't disturb the room. But curiosity won out. I flicked the switch, and the harsh light illuminated the room. It was empty, save for a dusty old rocking chair sitting near the window, facing the corner of the room. The chair was still, but as I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The floorboards around it were disturbed, as though something heavy had been dragged over them. I backed away slowly, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. What was going on? The rocking chair was not here when I moved in. I was sure of it. I hadn't put it there. My heart hammered in my chest, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. It could have been left behind by the previous owners, but that didn't explain the noise I'd heard. I turned to leave the room, but stopped dead in my tracks. A cold, dry breath swept across my neck. I could feel the hairs on the back of my head stand up. Something was behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. The rocking chair sat motionless in the corner. I didn't know how, but I knew I wasn't alone. I hurried back downstairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed my sister. She lived a few towns over, and although I didn't want to sound irrational, I needed to hear a familiar voice. The phone rang several times before she answered. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, sounding groggy. I'm freaking out, I said, my voice trembling. I'm hearing things, strange noises, and I swear I saw something upstairs. Are you sure it's not just the house settling? She replied. You've been there, a few weeks now? It's probably just the wind or something. I wanted to believe her. The wind had been howling all night, and the house was old. It could easily explain the strange sounds, but there was something in my gut telling me it wasn't that simple. I don't know, I murmured. It feels different. Like, I'm not alone. There was a pause on the other end. Do you want me to come over? I hesitated. I didn't want to seem ridiculous, but the dread in my chest was suffocating. No, it's fine. I'll be okay. I just need to make sure it's all in my head. All right, she said. Just be careful, and if you need me, call me. I hung up, still feeling the unease gnawing at me. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but every flicker of the screen, every creak of the house made my heart race. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something else was at play. The night stretched on, the minutes crawling by. I eventually went to bed, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had experienced. As I lay there in the dark, my eyelids heavy with exhaustion, I heard it again. The soft scrape of feet on the floor, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from upstairs. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I turned on the flashlight. I wasn't going to let this go. I had to know what was happening. I forced myself out of bed, my feet dragging against the cold floor, and I slowly made my way up the stairs. The hallway was silent. Too silent. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening intently. The scrape came again, closer this time, almost as if it was in the room with me. I walked down the hall toward the back bedroom. The door was wide open now, but the rocking chair was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, but before I could react, I felt the cold hand on my shoulder. It was icy, like it had come from the depths of a freezer. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I could hear it now, breathing, slow and labored, coming from behind me. My heart pounded in my chest. I whipped around again, but nothing was there. I ran downstairs as fast as my legs could carry me, my mind racing. I slammed the door to the basement and locked it behind me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed a bag and left that night. I never went back to the house on Willow Lane. The neighbors later told me that the house had a history. No one had lived there for long before moving out. Some said it was haunted, that the previous owner had died there under strange circumstances. I never learned the full story, and frankly, I didn't want to know. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I don't believe in ghosts, but whatever was in that house followed me for weeks. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the scraping noise. The feeling of being watched lingers, but I'm no longer in that house. I don't think I'll ever feel completely alone at night again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I've always been someone who likes the quiet, the solitude of being alone at night, just me in the house. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought it would be the perfect place to enjoy that quiet. It was a small 2-bedroom unit in an older building, the kind of place that's seen a lot of tenants come and go. The rent was cheap, and the apartment had a certain charm. Wooden floors that creaked underfoot, old windows that rattled in the wind, and an antique feel to everything. It seemed perfect for someone who wanted to be alone. The first few nights, everything was fine. I settled in, unpacked my things, and got into a routine. But that first real night, when the silence of the apartment wrapped around me like a blanket, something changed. It wasn't immediately obvious, just a subtle shift, but the longer I stayed, the more I realized that the quiet wasn't entirely peaceful. There was something lurking in it. It started with the sounds. They weren't loud at first, just faint noises, soft creaks of the floorboards when I was sure I was the only one home, the occasional tap on the walls, like fingernails scratching against the plaster. I told myself it was the old building settling, or maybe the pipes. But there was something about the way the sounds seemed too deliberate, too timed, that made me uneasy. At first, I dismissed it. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I'd been living on my own for a few months at that point, and sometimes the loneliness made me a little jumpy. But the sounds didn't stop. They started happening more often, usually late at night when the world outside was still and everyone else was asleep. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I had just started to drift off when I heard it, a soft tapping noise coming from somewhere in the apartment. I lay still, my heart racing, straining to listen. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make my skin prickle. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, the wind rattling the windows. But the sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. It came again, followed by a pause, and then a third tap, and then silence. I waited, my mind racing, but there was nothing. No more sounds, nothing that could explain what I just heard. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and stared into the dark room. I told myself it was nothing. I was just tired. Maybe it was a neighbor's footsteps or an animal outside. I lay back down, pulling the covers over my head as if that would shield me from whatever was happening. The next day, I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the noises didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, they grew more frequent. There were the occasional bumps, like something or someone was moving around in the other room. At times, I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the hallway, the soft shuffle of feet on the old wooden floors, as though someone was walking just out of sight. But whenever I got up to check, there was no one there. One night, I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard it again. This time, it was much clearer, louder. The sound of someone walking, slow and deliberate, right outside my bedroom door. My pulse quickened as I glanced toward the door. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. The footsteps continued, one after the other, coming closer. The floor creaked under each step, and I could almost feel the weight of whoever was out there. I waited, holding my breath, hoping it would stop. But the footsteps didn't. They came right up to my door, and then stopped. Silence. For a long moment, I didn't move. I was frozen in place, listening. But there was nothing, no more sounds, no more movement. I finally got up, my legs trembling as I crossed the room. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was dark, just as I had left it, but there was no one in sight, no one standing in the hallway, no one at the door. But the air felt heavier, colder somehow. I walked through the apartment, checking every room, but everything was as it should be. No one was there. I could feel my heart still racing, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. It wasn't just the fear of hearing something I couldn't explain. It was the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. I didn't know who or what was there with me, but it was there. After that night, I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was nothing more than my imagination. But the atmosphere in the apartment had changed. It felt different, as if the walls themselves were watching me. I couldn't stay in one place for too long without feeling like something was lurking in the shadows, just waiting. And I started to hear it more clearly. The whispers. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the background, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator or the sound of traffic outside. But as time went on, the whispers grew louder. It was like someone was speaking in another room, their voice muffled but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a voice. Low, almost crooning, like it was saying something just for me. I tried to brush it off. I kept telling myself that it was the wind, the old pipes, or even my neighbors, but nothing explained the sensation of being watched. Every time I passed a mirror or glanced at a dark corner, I felt something watching me, something that wasn't quite human. One night, after weeks of growing unease, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I stayed up late, sitting on the couch, determined to catch whatever it was in the act. My heart pounded as I waited, the apartment eerily silent, except for the sound of my own breath. It wasn't long before I heard it. Soft footsteps in the hallway. I held my breath, my chest tight with fear. I stood up slowly, walking toward the door. The footsteps grew louder, and as I reached for the handle, they stopped. Suddenly, everything went silent. I opened the door, my hand shaking, and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was still, the air thick with the kind of silence that presses in on you. I walked down the hallway, checking every room, but there was nothing. No one. Nothing out of place. Then, as I turned to head back to my room, I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light, a figure stood. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a shadowy shape, tall and thin, almost translucent. I froze, unable to move. My heart was pounding in my ears, and for a moment I thought I might faint, but I couldn't look away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there staring at me. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I ran out of the apartment that night, not caring about anything else. I didn't even grab my things. I just left. I stayed with a friend for a few days, but the fear didn't subside. I couldn't go back to that apartment. Not after what I'd seen. It wasn't just the noises anymore. It was the feeling of being watched, of something waiting for me in the dark. I never went back to that apartment. I found a new place, one where the quiet didn't feel so suffocating. But I'll never forget that feeling, the feeling of being completely alone at night, but knowing that I wasn't. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I moved into my apartment in late autumn, just before the holiday season, when the days were short and the nights stretched out like endless shadows. It was a cozy space, tucked in a quiet corner of a city that never really felt too busy. The building itself was old, over 100 years, with creaky floors and walls that could tell stories if they were able. It was perfect for me, peaceful, private, with just enough character to make it feel lived in. I thought I would enjoy the solitude, being alone at night, which had always been something I preferred. The first few nights were blissfully calm. The air outside was crisp, and the apartment had a comforting quietness that I found welcoming. I started a new routine, having moved away from my friends and family to start fresh. Each evening, after a long day of work, I'd make dinner, curl up with a book or watch TV, then turn in for the night. But soon, I began to notice something unsettling. Small things at first, things I could easily explain away. A door creaking when no one was near it, a gust of cold air when the windows were shut tight. At night, sometimes I would hear a faint tapping sound, like someone lightly knocking on the walls. But I convinced myself it was just the building settling, the sounds of old pipes or wind pressing against the structure. It was around the third week when things started to feel different. I was sitting on the couch one evening reading a book when I heard the sound again. This time it was more distinct. Tap, tap, tap. It came from behind me, from the wall adjoining the bedroom. I froze, holding my breath, but the sound stopped as quickly as it started. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the building, but that nagging feeling started to grow. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. I had lived in apartments before, but nothing like this. The sound kept returning every few nights, always at the same time, just before I was about to fall asleep. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate. And one night, it was especially loud. The taps were sharp and quick, almost as if someone was knocking urgently. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got up from the couch, my feet heavy as I walked toward the bedroom. There was no one there, of course. The room was still and dark. But as I stood in the doorway, I felt an odd chill run down my spine, like I wasn't completely alone. The air seemed thicker, heavier somehow, as though something was waiting in the shadows. I turned around and left the room quickly, pushing the door shut behind me. I didn't know what I was afraid of. There was no logical reason to be scared. Still, the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open, listening to the silence. But it wasn't truly silent. The faint tap-tap-tapping returned, only this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from inside the room. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught as I glanced around the darkened room, trying to spot whatever was causing the noise. There was nothing, no visible source, just the hollow, repetitive sound, as though something or someone was quietly tapping against the furniture. I forced myself to lie back down, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The tapping continued, persistent, like it was coming closer, closer to my bed. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get up, to leave the room, to do anything. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my entire body trembling. Finally, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the tapping. It was too quiet, too still, and in that silence, I felt the air in the room shift. It was as if something unseen had settled around me, watching, waiting. I had no idea how long I stayed like that. But when I finally managed to drift off into an uneasy sleep, I had the most vivid dream. In it, I was standing in the living room, looking out the window into the street below. I wasn't alone. There was a woman standing beside me. She was pale, with dark hair that hung loosely around her face. Her eyes were wide, but there was something about them, empty, hollow, almost lifeless. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my body frozen. And then she looked directly at me, her mouth opening slowly as though she wanted to say something. But before she could, I woke up with a start, my heart racing. I was drenched in sweat, my sheets twisted around me. I sat up quickly, looking around the room. The room was the same, still, dark, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. The tapping, the whispers, the cold drafts, it was all too much. I couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, couldn't shake the feeling that something was lingering in the corners of the apartment, something I couldn't see but could sense in my bones. The next evening, I packed up a few things and went to stay at a friend's house. I figured maybe a few nights away would clear my mind, give me a break from the oppressive atmosphere. When I returned to the apartment a couple of days later, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread as I walked through the door. It felt different, almost as if the air had changed. The space seemed colder now, the shadows deeper. But I dismissed it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I went about my evening routine, trying to ignore the unease that lingered at the back of my mind. But then, around midnight, the tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. I heard it clearly from the hallway outside my bedroom door. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I walked out into the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The apartment was silent again, but I knew the sound would return. It always did. I stood by the bedroom door, listening, waiting. And then I heard it, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. I held my breath. The sound wasn't just a tapping now. It was something heavier, something that made the floor shake beneath my feet. A slow, deliberate thud, thud, thud. I couldn't stay here anymore. I turned and fled, leaving the apartment behind. I didn't care about my things, didn't care about anything but getting out. I stayed at my friend's place again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of the apartment. It haunted me. Even when I wasn't there, I could hear the noises echoing in my mind. The next day, I called a paranormal investigator. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but I didn't know who else to turn to. They came to the apartment, set up their equipment, and spent hours checking the place out. When they left, they told me they had found evidence. Something they couldn't explain, something they couldn't ignore. They didn't say much else, just that they couldn't stay for long. As they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again, that the same hollow, lifeless eyes were staring at me from the darkness. I never went back to that apartment. It stayed vacant for a long time, and though I've moved on to another place, I can still hear the faint tapping sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying alone in bed. Story, the end.